Hello, this is Yuri Kinseko. For my literary analysis, I decided to do mine on Charlotte Perkins' The Yellow Wallpaper. Now I want to give a brief introduction to what this presentation is really going to be about, and as well as Charlotte Perkins as a whole in this story. So, Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper is a cornerstone of feminist literature offering a piercing critique of the 19th century patriarchal structures that stifled women. This analysis, which is based on two sources, which are Vallet and Khalif. This analysis, based on two sources, as previously stated, informed by Vallet's exploration of Gilman's economic vision for women and Khalif's psychological interpretation of the story, which underscores how the protagonist's confinement reflects systematic oppression. Now, even though we've already gone over this in class and we've read the story and dissected the story all together in class, I still wanted to refresh the memories of those who may have forgotten what the story was about, because it's very important to understand what the story is about so you can understand the context of this analysis. So, this story follows an unnamed woman suffering from postpartum depression who is prescribed the rest cure by her physician husband John. He confines her to a nursery with barred windows and yellow wallpaper. She is forbidden from writing, which worsens her mental state. As her isolation deepens, she becomes obsessed with the wallpaper, believing it contains a trapped woman in a cage. Eventually, she descends into madness, tearing down the wallpaper in an attempt to free the imaginary woman. John, witnessing her enveloped in madness, faints in the doorway, which then concludes the story. Now that we've refreshed our memories and tried to remember what the story was about, here is the context for this literary analysis. The Yellow Wallpaper critiques societal norms that oppress women. This analysis will focus on themes of gender roles, mental health, and isolation. The central question I want to pose is, how does this story depict the psychological and societal oppression of women? Now, the first answer to that question I just asked will be oppression through isolation, which is going to be the first thing we're going to really observe that is prevalent throughout the story. The protagonist's husband, John, embodies patriarchal authority, dismissing her thoughts and prescribing the rest cure. Khalif notes, which is one of our sources, notes that this treatment isolated women both physically and emotionally under the guise of care. In The Yellow Wallpaper, this enforced solitude worsens the protagonist's mental health struggles, stripping her of any meaningful human connection. The barred windows and the oppressive wallpaper in her room symbolize her entrapment both physically and mentally. Another huge aspect of the story which really coincides with oppression through isolation is the narrator's loss of autonomy. Gilman portrays the protagonist's descent into madness as the direct consequence of her lack of agency. The narrator's creative outlets, such as her writing, are forbidden by her husband. This reflects how the societal norms of the era denied women of intellectual pursuits. The author of the article, Vallet, which is, again, one of our sources, ties this observation to the broader critique of economic dependency, showing how women's lack of financial independence reinforced their oppression, which basically, I think a lack of rights, especially in this era, would also coincide with their loss of autonomy. Now, it is important to note that not only did, in this patriarchal society where women oppressed by the loss of autonomy, financial dependence on men, there is also a very big issue of internalized oppression. The story demonstrates how women internalize societal expectations. The narrator initially trusts her husband's judgment, believing in the prescribed cure despite its harm. The narrator convinces herself her husband knows better than herself. The author of the article, again one of our sources, Khalif, explains this in a reflection of how patriarchal norms conditioned women to doubt their own instincts and defer to male authority. Because women lacked so much autonomy and rights as a whole, they were believed to think, well, these men are superior, the men will know better, even though that may not have been the case. Now, hitting the tail end of the story, where the narrator really starts to unravel, we have a whole section of her analysis of her breaking down. As the protagonist's obsession with the wallpaper grows, it becomes a metaphor for her struggle against oppression. The figure she perceives as trapped behind the wallpaper reflects her own entrapment. Her eventual breakdown, where she tears at the wallpaper, can be interpreted as a rebellion against the societal constraints imposed on her. While tragic, this act signifies a desperate assertion of identity and agency. I perceived when we read this story that this narrator was so out of her mind with everything being taken from her that this was her only way to show that she still had some source of identity and, once again, agency. Now, why did I choose this story out of all the short stories we've read? And what does this story mean to me? Well, I think there's a lot of broader implications that can be found from the story, and I think it's very much so still prevalent to today's issues. Some of the broader implications of Gilman's story is not just a critique on individual relationships, but also of systematic issues. Vallett and Khalif underscore how Gilman advocated for societal changes, including shared domestic responsibilities and economic reforms, to free women from dependence. The story's haunting imagery drives home the psychological toll of ignoring these issues, which again are still so prevalent today. Now, to kind of wrap up and conclude everything that I've stated, and hopefully you understood what I'm trying to get across, my conclusions are: the Yellow Wallpaper remains a powerful narrative, illustrating the oppressive structures that constrained women in Gilman's era. Through vivid symbolism and psychological depth, the story critiques societal norms and highlights the urgent need for autonomy and equality. Gilman's work, as analyzed by scholars like Vallett and Khalif, continues to inspire conversations about gender, mental health, and systematic reform. These are still issues prevalent in our society today. By encouraging more conversation, we can work to tackle these problems. Another thing I wanted to add is this story felt very personal to me because I found myself relating to the narrator, even though I'm not a mother going through postpartum. But I think living in a still patriarchal society, maybe not as much, but a lot of the mentality we have now, I could understand why the narrator kind of lost her mind. So I think it's a story that's still very modern, and I think it's really powerful that despite not being written in this era, it still carries on today. Lastly, here are my citations, which is obviously my two biggest sources from this presentation, Vallett and Khalif, and Gilman herself. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and hopefully I did a good job.